Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Johann George Krunitz wrote a 242-volume encyclopedia in longhand. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a way that a man chose a woman for marriage, regardless of beauty. Medieval English churches were usually equipped with a heavy parish chest, which determined whether a wedding would or would not take place. It was used as a premarital aptitude test by prospective young brides. To pass, a candidate for marriage had to lift the 30-pound lid with one hand. If she flunked, the girl was considered too weak to cope with the arduous tasks of a housewife, and the groom could call the whole thing off. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Bedrooms in the cantons of Grisons, Switzerland, have tiny windows opened when the occupant is dying, so his soul can escape. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about cows who grow their own gold teeth. Not to be confused with the goose who laid the golden eggs, were the cows in the state of Washington who actually grew gold teeth. Amazing, but a matter of fact. These bovines grazed in the Alder Creek Basin near a famous gold mine, and as they chewed, they picked up gold dust embedded in the ground. The chemical combination of lime in the cow's teeth and the gold dust created a perfect and permanent and valuable gold dental crown. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Bees in the state of Goiás, Brazil, cannot sting. They also produce sour honey. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a tennis star who made his point in more ways than one. It seems Charles de la Haye, the famous French tennis star, was not satisfied to prove his skills on the tennis court by winning scores alone. He once stepped onto the court dressed in the full uniform of the French National Guard, carrying a full field pack, musket with fixed bayonet, sidearms, plumed helmet, all the ceremonial regalia, and played 4 sets of tennis this way, beating his opponent, who was in conventional tennis clothes, by a score of 3 sets to 1. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
At the Amarillo Tri-State Fair, a racehorse named 1760 won its race and paid $17.60. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a curious sort of home sweet home. The people who live in Cycre, a small village on the island of Crete, never spent Christmas at home, or the New Year, or any other day in the winter, because it's impossible. The town literally disappears in the winter, covered by an onrush of water which buries the homes and shops of these island people. However, come the first signs of spring, and the waters recede, then disappear, and the villagers return, set up housekeeping again, until the next flood. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Lincoln is the only president of the United States whose last military rank before becoming chief executive was private. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the craziest military drill in all history. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia devised one of the craziest and, in a sense, cruelest military drills ever known. It was called the water drill and was designed to perfect a crisp marching style. The drill consisted of a soldier who practiced goose-stepping while carrying a glass of water on top of his military hat. If the Russian soldier spilled as much as a single drop, he was obliged to serve an additional year for every drop of water he spilled. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. Ripleys. Believe it or not.
For King Henry II of England, it was always good to be on your toes. Maybe that's why he always ate his meals standing up. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a gesture of good manners helped a lady become a queen. The ways of emperors in choosing their wives have intrigued historians for centuries. Leo VI of the East made his choice a genuine competition among the ladies. Each candidate was obliged to sit barefooted on the floor, and at a signal, each arose, donned her slippers, and executed a curtsy. The winner of this curious contest, Theophano, became empress for 25 years, all because she could curtsy better than anyone else. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The Dade of Africa, an animal smaller than a rabbit, is the nearest living relative to the elephant. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who had a strange hatred of money. Joseph Hadik Barkosi of Hungary was one of the earliest cases of a man desiring to become a woman. He wanted to become a woman legally because he hated money. It seems the law required a family fortune to pass on to the male member of the remaining line. But Barkosi wasn't interested. He had the courts declare him a woman, and the fortune was passed on. He did, however, change his name from Joseph to Josephina. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Perhaps one reason why the elephant has been employed by men in heavy-duty construction work is that the elephant is the only animal with 4 knees. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man possessed by his name. Baron Hermann von Mitternacht, Prime Minister of the state of Württemberg, was certainly preoccupied with his own name. Mitternacht is an adaptation of the German word for midnight, and midnight became the ruling force in his life. He was married at midnight. He ate his main meal at midnight. He signed all official documents at midnight, named his dog Midnight, hired servants named Midnight, and among many other things, died.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Marie Antoinette never really said, "Let them eat cake." The actual words in translation were, "Let them eat rolls." Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a story about a toothache that led to a massacre. A toothache that affected Queen Namasole of Uganda, Africa, also affected the entire population of a neighboring province called Vuma. The queen, in her anguish of pain, consulted some tribal witches, who said the queen's toothache would be cured if she put the entire population of Vuma to death. The witches' weird cure was tried. 25,000 people were driven into Lake Victoria and drowned. But mass murder didn't cure the toothache. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Danny London was hit with a lucky punch. Born deaf and dumb, he was hit during a boxing match, and the punch gave him his hearing and his speech. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the church that's always up to date. Salisbury Cathedral bears the curious creative talents of her builders in the form of features related to the calendar. It has as many doors as there are months in the year, as many windows as there are days, as many pillars as there are hours, as many sculptures as there are minutes in an hour, as many consecration crosses as there are seconds in a minute. However, the architects neglected one detail. The tower leans 22.5 inches off center. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Long before there were any of today's methods of measuring, people in India measured distances by the sound of a cow's moo. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the blood-curdling story of a doomed man's last reward. One of the great injustices in the bloody French Revolution was the execution of Antoine Laurent Lavoisier, the founder of modern chemistry. He was arrested on totally trumped-up charges and sentenced to the guillotine. But France's great scientist was not to die without recognition of his contribution to learning. So Lavoisier was awarded France's highest scientific award, the Wreath of Everlasting Flowers. The next day, they cut off his head. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The first holiday greeting card ever sent in America was sent by none other than pistol-packing Annie Oakley. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the incredible story of the greatest clothes horse in history. Prince Wenzel von Koenigsegg-Reitberg, an Austrian chancellor, was the most clothes-conscious man who ever lived. For 57 years, he changed clothes completely 30 times a day. Assuming he slept 8 hours a day, this meant a change every 32 minutes. And this wasn't merely jacket and trousers. It involved laces, decorations, countless effects. Yet, in spite of his preoccupation, he was the leading figure in European politics for 42 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
One of the great geographical oddities in the world is the harbor of Forio in the Isle of Ischia, Italy. The water in the harbor is so hot you can boil an egg in it. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a strange way to die. In February 1908, Baron von Kirstein led a caravan of 40 men in an attempt to conquer Mount Karasimbi in Central Africa. At 12,000 feet, a furious gale began howling through the mountains. The mountain climbers were gradually being frozen by the frigid winds of these high altitudes, in spite of the fact they were directly on the equator. The grim toll reached 20 dead, frozen to death under a tropic sun. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A colorful touch to the court of King Abd el-Motadid of Seville were the flower pots. They were made from the skulls of enemies killed by the king in battle. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a living library. Hanawa Hokichi of Japan became blind at the age of 7 and devoted the rest of his life to teaching. His memory was so vast he was able to store the contents of some 400,000 manuscripts, which he compiled into the Gunsho Luiju, a work of almost 3,000 volumes, and still considered a priceless reference work by students in Japan. A library created by a blind man. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
It must be quite a crazy sight to the visitors, but beggars who go out on the Yangtze River to meet foreign steamships paddle out in wooden bathtubs. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the useless military guard. The fantastic reputation as warrior and conqueror belongs almost exclusively to Napoleon. In fact, only recently has the fear of Napoleon been finally dispelled. It happened when a man named Chummy Barton died in 1944. He was the last of a long line of armed sentries maintained by the English to watch for the return of Napoleon over the Strait of Dover. even though Napoleon had been dead for over a century. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The Russians don't really have an H-bomb. How could they? There's no letter H in the Russian alphabet. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the extraordinary story of a tree that became the costliest tree in history. The Tree of Obedience, located in a barren desert in Egypt, is some 1,600 years old. The legend is that a saintly hermit took a dry stick, stuck it in the ground, and told a disciple to water the stick until it bore fruit. It took the entire night to complete the trip to water and back, and he watered the tree every day for 3 years until it sprouted fruit. Altogether, 500,000 man-hours have kept the Tree of Obedience alive. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Taking up a musical instrument? Try the kissar. This African instrument is made of a human skull and the horns of a gazelle. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the amusing story of a princess who kept a dark secret. The first equestrienne to ride side saddle was Anne of Bohemia, daughter of the German Emperor Charles IV. She was born with one leg shorter than the other and was unable to ride a horse in the normal fashion. A special saddle was designed for her so that she could ride with both legs on the same side. Her vanity kept her from revealing the secret of her deformed legs, so that the saddle was termed a fashion innovation rather than a horse-mounted wheelchair. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A tooth of the famed physicist Sir Isaac Newton was purchased for 730 pounds, over $3,000. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who inherited his own fortune. He lived to tell about it, how he inherited his own fortune. He was Felix Zeme, the noted French painter. After earning a fortune as a painter of Venetian landscapes, Zeme retired. To such utter obscurity, he was presumed dead. Just before his fortune was to pass to his relatives, he reappeared. But because the red tape of proving himself alive was so vast, he rewrote his own will, leaving his fortune to himself. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
As a form of punishment, King Eystein Ilrad of Norway made a greyhound dog the ruler of one of his districts. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the opera singer who was almost killed by her voice. Elizabeth Billington, the great English opera singer, was undoubtedly conscious of musical criticism, but only up to a point. She was the victim of the strangest criticism an audience ever tendered a performer. It happened in Naples in May 1794. In Inez de Castro, she sang with such beauty and power, Neapolitans accused her of causing volcanic Mount Vesuvius to erupt a month after her performance. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A cat was born on the Stetter Ranch in Nebraska with the cattle brand clearly visible on its side. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a governor who had nothing to govern. John Whitaker held one of the most curious jobs in the history of American government. It was actually no job at all, but he was committed to it by the will of the people. He was elected governor of the state of Oregon before it was a state. People who lived in the Oregon Territory were pretty sure of being admitted to statehood, so they held their local elections anyway. But Governor Whitaker was unable to govern until Congress made Oregon a state. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Mosquitoes prefer blondes, but they're female mosquitoes, the only ones who bite, and they consider the skin of a blonde less resistant. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who couldn't sleep. Armand Jacques Lerbet of Paris suffered a terrible affliction. He couldn't sleep. As a child during the French Revolution, Lerbet had an accident. An observation stand collapsed, damaging his brain. Rushed to the hospital, he ultimately recovered, but couldn't close his eyes. His condition lasted all through life, 71 years. Yet he became a great lawyer, widely known as the legal light that is never extinguished. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The United States has observed only one national holiday in its history, the 100th anniversary of Washington's inauguration. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the oldest language in the world. The oldest language in the world isn't spoken between one man and another. It's spoken between man and the elephant. It's the language of the Indian mahout, the professional elephant driver. In addressing the elephant, the mahout uses neither Hindi nor Arabic nor Persian, three of the oldest still spoken languages. Rather, he speaks to his elephant in the language of the caveman, with which the first elephant was trained 50,000 years ago. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
On the same day the United States went off the gold standard, a man reported his goldfish turned silver. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an act of patriotism with a twist. To Mrs. A.A. Bile of South Africa, a once-in-a-lifetime coincidence happened during World War II. Mrs. Bile baked 150 cakes for a detachment of troops stationed in Europe. After she'd finished her baking, she noticed that her wedding ring was missing and concluded it was lost in one of her just-baked cakes. Mrs. Bile sent the cakes off with a note in each, asking for her ring if it were found. The ring was found by Sergeant Ronnie Vile, her own son. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
You can tell how fast you're traveling on a train by listening to the number of rail clicks. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the king who condemned a river to death. The Gidnis River, now known as the Diyala in Iraq, is the only river that was sentenced to death and executed. The prosecutor in the case was King Cyrus of Persia. While crossing the river, he lost one of his sacred white horses in a drowning accident. The king was so incensed, he ordered channels dug to divert the waters of the river. And the river did die for 1,000 years, until the sands dried up the channels and the river flowed once again over its original course. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Aristophane, an ancient Athenian legislator, was impeached a total of 75 times, but never once convicted. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a game of chess that drove a man crazy. The game of chess figured in a strange medical experiment. Count Istvan Zachenyi, a famous Hungarian scientist in the 1800s, went insane, and the game of chess was prescribed as a possible cure, the idea being that concentration would help the brain. A young student was hired to play chess with the mad count, and they played for 6 long years. The count was cured, but the student went out of his mind, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
John Coleridge Patteson, Bishop of Melanesia, compiled 25 dictionaries, each in a language he had just learned. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a marriage, 14th century style. The court of King Pedro I of Castile was apparently in need of a marriage counselor, for this king was involved in a marriage with a curious twist. It took place in 1354 at Cuellar, Spain. The bride was Juana de Castro. No one really knows what happened, but the following day the king had the marriage annulled and left without ever seeing the lady again. Thus, she became history's only queen for a day. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The dome palm tree of Egypt is the only palm tree with branches and bears fruit that tastes like gingerbread. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a king who couldn't say no. Dulu Murad Khan, ruler of Rawalpindi, India, was known as the cruel philanthropist. In a time when the death sentence was administered for the act of begging, Dulu Khan was frequently accosted and asked for money. He would either give the beggar a lakh of rupees, worth $48,500, or have the beggar killed. The death sentence was administered when the Dulu Khan was momentarily short of cash because he couldn't bear to say no. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A second-hand statue of Lord Byron was purchased in London and erected in Ecuador, honoring a different poet named Olmedo, because to build an original would have cost too much. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a bloody oath. Ling Wen called his Chinese emperor, Young Lo, a traitor to his face and was sentenced to have his head cut off. But people counseled the accused to beg mercy of the emperor so that he might live. However, Ling Wen refused, saying he'd called the emperor a traitor even after he died, which is exactly what happened. For as the blood dripped on the sand from the severed neck of Ling Wen, it formed the Chinese character for the word traitor. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
In a war during the reign of Empress Anna Ivanovna of Russia, cannons and cannonballs were made from blocks of ice. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a terrifying day when a missionary's prayers were answered in flame. Miracles do happen. One happened in the Kyukyu territory in Africa, where Mr. and Mrs. Stuart Watts and their 4 children had a mission. Bloodthirsty Kyukyus had besieged the Watts mission. Declining an offer of military help, the family prayed for a miracle and got one. A blinding light in the sky scared off the savages, caused by a flaming meteor, the first to ever fall in that part of Africa. Believe it or not.